As with any position, the welding inspector needs to be able to communicate effectively with many people in the shop, fabrication, construction, or even in the office. The inspector needs to also listen to the important stakeholders of the project or maintenance activity the inspector is involved in. The following are the different personnel the inspector needs to communicate with on a daily basis. These personnel are the welder, the welding engineer, this is the one creating the welding specifications, the designer project engineer, this is the one creating the design of the component. Note that there's a distinction between the two, the welding engineer and the design engineer, the welding foreman, the shop or field superintendent, the reporting supervisor, the plant manager. Note that in my experience sitting down for the exam, there are a couple of questions that appeared solely in these communication lines around the inspector. First, the welder. The welder is one of the, if not the most important part in attaining production and quality of the work. It is important that the welding inspector has a good working relationship with the welder and that he constantly communicates with him regarding the production requirements, quality control procedures, inspection procedures, among others. I once got involved in a project where it is significantly behind schedule. Then we discovered that not only that the production welders are not enough, but they are underpaid. We immediately informed the contractor's project manager that this cannot continue and they will have liquidated damages should the project be delayed further. Then, after a couple of weeks, they complied with our requirement and they supplied with supplementary manpower with enough welders. And the project corrected itself with regards to the schedule. If there is a good working relationship between the welder and its inspector, mistakes can be discovered before it becomes significant to the production schedule. Sometimes, the welder can immediately raise his concerns so that the inspector can immediately pass judgment and provide the appropriate corrective action. This is why effective communication is important between the two personnel. Not only it will affect quality, but the schedule of the work as well. If the welding inspector has welding experience, the welder will more likely trust his decisions because the inspector knows, for example, the difficulty in preparing the joint prior welding, and he will trust that the inspector be able to understand the welder's point of view and thus be able to point the root cause of the quality issue if it comes to it. The next personnel that the welding inspector needs to communicate effectively is the welding engineer. The welding engineer is in charge of creating the welding procedure specifications. Those specifications are part of the quality assurance program of the organization. The welding inspector, meanwhile, is in charge of the quality control generally, hence the eyes of the welding engineer, ensuring that the specifications are being followed and complied with. The inspector makes sure that these procedures are followed. For example, in the WPS, the heat input, current amperage indicated, the welding technique, and other parameters shall be complied with in the construction or fabrication site. Now, there may be a time when the procedure is now to be qualified but cannot seem to pass, or the welding specification is very difficult to apply on site because of site constraints. Thus, preparation will not yield a satisfactory weld. The inspector will communicate with the welding engineer to make revisions of the specifications, so it can be more suited to the application, or these specifications can no longer meet the requirement. In other words, it just keeps failing the tests when you proceed to qualify them. This is where the feedback loop between the welding inspector and engineer becomes very important in assuring quality. The next personnel is the design engineer. The design engineer is responsible for creating the design documents and shop drawing for fabrication. With this, some questions can only be answered by the designer of the component or structure. In this case, this is the design engineer. Clarifications might arise with the welding symbols. For example, the inspector found an incomplete penetration of the weld, which is a discontinuity. Experienced weld inspector will know that IJP or incomplete joint penetration might be part of the design. Thus, he shall inquire with the design engineer regarding the details for confirmation. Welding foremen are normally hired in the fabrication or construction sites for big projects. This is to supervise the progress of the welders closely, not only in terms of production, but also with regards to quality. Sometimes the welding inspector, instead of directly communicating with the welders, have to communicate with the welding foreman, especially for matters that involve why a weld is being rejected by a specialist. I encountered a scenario during an oil refinery shutdown where I was involved in as part of maintenance, where the welders are consistently producing defective welds and is affecting the schedule of the activity. To avoid direct confrontation at site, because some of the welders I know is pressured due to the schedule, I have addressed the concern to their foreman. Sometimes elevating these concerns are necessary as well to a higher authority if the problem persists. The shop or field superintendent focuses on the productivity of the shop and ensures the work are on top of the schedule. Schedule concerns. The welding inspector communicates with him for any activity that may cause slippage in the schedule, or also if the job will be finished earlier than expected, so that the resources can be effectively allocated to that activity. Status updates. The welding inspector may also give the shop superintendent status updates, especially for critical work, again solely for the purpose of ensuring that resources are efficiently allocated. This is important as the shop superintendent needs to ensure that production is on top of the schedule. If such work will need rework due to quality issues or a job is just too big for the manpower allocation, it needs to be communicated with the shop superintendent so that crashing of resources can be considered if needed. Sometimes resource replacement might also be done. For example, a defective or ineffective equipment or tools is causing the delay. As they say, every one of us has a supervisor. As with any job or position, the welding inspector also has a supervisor or a superior who is in charge of checking our work. The reporting supervisor sometimes need to have, or the welding inspector sometimes need to have his work or inspection report verified by the reporting supervisor. If the decision may be too difficult for the welding inspector or beyond his capability or experience, the welding inspector may consult his supervisor for the interpretation of quality requirements or sometimes the result of the inspection itself. If the welding inspector may have job functions that needs him to communicate with other departments of the organization, the supervisor can help him raise those concerns. With his innate authority or internal knowledge of the company's politics and inner workings, should the welding inspector be unable to communicate this ahead of time because of just the production schedule, he needs to deal with the production schedule and the amount of inspection that he needs to do at site. This is especially true in a major shutdown works, for example, where inspection can happen one after the other. And if interdepartment concerns are needed to be relayed, the supervisors can help the inspector do this aspect of the job. The plant manager is in charge of the plant operations. He ensures that maintenance and operations done in the plant are completed properly. Similar with the shop superintendent, but for the plant operations. Since the plant manager is in charge of the plant operations, he needs to know when he can start up the plant and mobilize his personnel to be allocated in the areas where he can do this. This is especially important in oil and gas industry since every day of a plant shutdown is millions of dollars wasted. The plant manager might also be interested in the report that the welding inspector will be providing. The welding inspector needs to turn over these documents properly so that in the future, it will be properly referenced, and if failure occurs down the line, it can be used in the root cause analysis, whether it is part of the probable cause or ruled out ruled out as one of the causes. And that ends the lecture regarding the communication lines around the inspector. Thank you for listening and see you on the next one.